Good morning, afternoon, evening, or whatever time of day it is that you're listening to this, and welcome to the first installment of the Talking Thomas podcast, a podcast dedicated to Thomas the Tank Engine and everything surrounding him. I'm Tony.
And I'm Orion.
And we are two big fans of Thomas the Tank Engine and all of its associated artifacts. We've been in the fandom since about 2007, I believe.
Just about, yeah, about 12 years.
Right. And we had this idea to, because there's not a whole lot of podcasts dedicated to Thomas the Tank Engine. There's one or two that I can think of offhand, but that's not a lot compared to other shows. And so Orion and I decided that we were going to do a podcast all about that. And we have sort of there's a whole selection of things to talk about. There's, of course, the show itself. There's Shining Time Station, which brought Thomas to America. And, of course, there's the merchandising. And so we're going to be putting out 2 episodes a week for a while. And it'll be a mixture of commentaries of the show, commentaries of Shining Time Station, and discussions about merchandise. Anything else that we want to add in there?
No, I mean, just really, it'll be a wide-ranging series of discussions about the Thomas franchise in general. Focus more on the classic series for sure.
Right.
Both of us are a little more biased towards those original 7 series, so we're not as into the later series, but we certainly will discuss those from time to time,
right,
as time allows.
Exactly. So the bulk of the podcast will be commentaries of the first 7 seasons of Thomas the Tank Engine. As you can probably tell, we're both from the United States, and as such, with some exceptions where appropriate, we'll mostly be talking using U.S. terms. Occasionally, we might reference the UK terms, but it'll be mostly US ones that we use. So we're going to start off, of course, appropriately at the beginning with the first ever episode of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends. And so because it's a commentary, it is advised that you listen to this podcast whilst watching the show. And so, of course, the first episode is Thomas and Gordon, or as we would say in the U.S., Thomas Gets Tricked. And we will begin that in just a moment here. So get your whatever kind of device you're watching Thomas on, get that loaded up, and press play now. And we begin with a lovely opening shot of Thomas.
Absolutely, and this is great. Establishes Thomas as his overall physical attributes, but then also really establishes the tone of the show right from the get-go with that busy theme, and it's just it's a great beginning to a wonderful series, and I think it really helped to set it apart from other British children's television series of the time period, especially the music. I mean, the music really just sets it a mile apart from anything else that came out at the time.
Yeah, I completely agree. And throughout this podcast, I'm sure you'll hear Orion and I both go on about how good the music is, the music of Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell. And they really put so much dedication. They put their all into this music. And I like how each engine, or at least of the main engines, each engine gets its own little theme, and sometimes more than one as well. So,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, right from the start, it establishes the kind of leitmotif method that Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell used of each character having their own theme. And Thomas has a few little themes in this episode, a few little ditties like this one where he just ran away after waking Gordon up. Right. And then later we hear Gordon's theme, or the Express theme, which is used in many other forms throughout the rest of the series.
Oh, yes. And that was a nice bit of stop motion animation, couple seconds ago, right before Thomas runs away, where Gordon has his eyes closed, but then suddenly has them open. That's a very nice use of stop motion animation.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, and not something that we saw too much throughout the series, but certainly helped. Now, this episode, of course, did set the precedent for the rest of the series of establishing Knapford as the name of the big station rather than Tidmouth,
right?
As it is in the Railway series. And it's never really been explained, as far as I know, why that change, unless I missed something. But
No.
I'm not quite sure why.
No, it really hasn't, and I can't think of why, other than maybe it was just easier to make Knapford with what they had, because the first season, as fantastic as it is, and the first season is fantastic, it doesn't quite have as big a budget as later seasons would. Not that any of them had a huge budget, but because it was a brand new series, and I don't know that Britt Allcroft or anyone connected to this aside from Tugs. I know that David Mitton and Robert Cardona did Tugs, but aside from that, I don't know that there were many projects for any of them before Thomas.
No, absolutely, and of course, Tugs was after the first two series of Thomas. But
That's right.
Love the shot of the viaduct.
Oh yeah.
This is just a great, again, establishing the island of Sodor in model form.
Right.
But right from the get-go, the production design just is great, and it would get even better as the series went on. Really.
Oh yes.
But this establishes it well, and you can influence of see Reginald Dalby illustrations on this first series, as most of the books that they adapted for the series were. All originally had the C. Reginald Dalby illustrations, with the exception of this story here is adapted from Thomas the Tank Engine, which had illustrations by Reginald Payne.
Right.
And then also the later episodes that come were adapted from the Three Railway Engines, which, of course, were originally illustrated by William Middleton, although I'm sure what they went off of was the reprint with the illustrations by C. Reginald Dalby.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And the cinematography here, as Thomas crosses the viaduct at night, is just gorgeous. It's not talked about that much, but I feel it is one of the more iconic scenes in the series.
Oh, absolutely. That scene specifically is just one that really sticks out in my mind, and I'm not quite sure why, but it has always really just stuck out in my mind as a classic scene. And the backdrops, I mean, really has to be said. Robert Galliers did a lot of all those backdrops for the series, and really again just set the tone. The sunny blue skies with little puffy clouds, and then of course that kind of sunset shot with the pink and orange and red hues in it really helps to set a nice tone.
Right.
So.
Right. And that was Thomas Get Striped. So great way to start off the series. So.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it's a fair difference in titling for the U.S. Thomas and Gordon can be a tad bit mundane to try to sell it to U.S. audiences.
Right.
Of course, originally these episodes wouldn't have had titles when they were part of Shining Time Station. They were just stories within the episode of Shining Time Station. But once they were released on home video in the U.S., they gave them the U.S. titles. But I think some of the other titles were kind of
Yeah.
The American titles versus the UK titles. But Thomas Gets Tricked is a fair renaming of a rather mundane episode title, as is the next one that we'll talk about, which is Edward Helps Out,
exactly.
As opposed to Edward and Gordon, the UK title.
Right. And speaking of that, load up whatever type of device you're watching this on. And again, we're watching Edward and Gordon, also known as Edward Helps Out. And press play now. All right. Now, this establishing shot right here, we get to see the main five. Of course, we've only met two of the main fives thus far, and we're meeting the third one, Gordon. So But I do like this establishing shot outside of the sheds.
Absolutely, a bit of a continuity error, of course, in that James is already shown here when later he's supposed to be a new engine when Thomas, uh, when Thomas rescues him
Right.
after his runaway train, and Thomas and the breakdown train, or Thomas saves the day, the U.S. title.
Right.
But this is again a nice little ditty for Edward here.
Oh, yes.
That the introduction of Edward's theme, and again, it was reworked many, many times throughout the rest of the series. But this is nice too because we get to see some more locations on the island that we haven't seen yet, apart from a few shots of the opening titles.
Right. And we see some different coaches here as well, because in the first episode, aside from a couple of stock coaches in the background, we really only saw the express coaches, whereas here we see coaches that Edward pulls frequently, the Ertl models of which were dubbed the old coaches. I don't know that they necessarily have those names within the show, but yes. So.
And we got our first night shot of the series back there just a few moments ago, and as we know, the late great David Mitton loved his night shots.
Oh yes,
and it was those were not too many of those in the first series. A few, most of them at Tim the Sheds, really.
Right.
And of course, the entire episode of The Flying Kipper, or most of the episode of The Flying Kipper, is set at night. But in series 2, there were certainly a lot more nighttime themed episodes.
Now, this bit, rewatching this bit with Edward shunting, it always gets me. It always tickles me a little bit, rather, how the Troublesome Trucks in series 1, the faces are quite different from what they were from series 2 onwards, because, from series 2, they get the gray rectangular faces similar to the engines. But in the first series, they just have eyes and a little squiddly black mark for a mouth.
Right, which in some ways is closer to some of the as far as I recall, some of the C. Reginald Dalby illustrations.
Right.
But when John T. Kenny came along, that's more of that style and more of the style of the gray faces.
Right.
And that is, of course, most of the episodes of series 2, or a lot of them, and onward, were adapted from books illustrated by John T. Kenny. So that perfectly makes sense to change that. And then also it just gives the show a bit of a more uniform look of the
right.
of all of the characters having the same style face, apart from some of the ones that retained their look, such as Annie and Clarabelle.
Oh, definitely. I do. This is a good scene as well, with Edward pushing Gordon up the hill as well.
Yeah, and I love the Gordon's Hill set.
Oh yes.
And again, it was reworked from time to time. In A Close Shave, we see the top points,
right,
which we don't see in any other episode, or switches for American audiences, of course. But and then I just love the crest of the hill here that we see. So it's kind of 3 different sets that they combined into one, really, to give you the idea of a hill. But and in some of the other episodes, Percy Runs Away is one that comes to mind. We see the other side of the hill too.
Right.
So some nice shots here, and then of course it goes right into Marin Station.
And here's where we have a nice little face swap here, in that Edward's exhausted face would later go to James, and it's actually more recognizable as James's tired face.
Yeah, they seem to not want to use that for Edward's anymore. And they just gave it to James.
Right. But regardless, I think the first 2 episodes were quite good and really established the tone of the series and the way the series would go from there on. And because, of course, the show is called Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, it was a good idea, of course, to start with Thomas and Gordon rather than Edward and Gordon. As good as both of those episodes are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, over the years, and we've been in the fandom a long, long time now. I've seen many complaints and gripes about the fact that the show started with a Thomas episode as opposed to starting the way the Railway series started with Edward. But they had to establish Thomas as the main character. Although, having said that, they do. I was thinking about this as we were watching that if the show was made today as Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, with Thomas being the main character, I would definitely be sure that they would not have necessarily adapted so many stories that did not have Thomas at the center.
Right.
I would imagine they would have shoehorned him in more of these episodes, as they did in the third season, more so. Or they would have written their own stories to feature Thomas right from the get-go, as opposed to waiting a couple seasons. Now, of course, they had to use the stories because of the original contract that they had with Kay and Ward, who were the publishers at the time.
Right.
But having said that, it's great that in these first two series, really the other characters get a lot of episodes that showcase their stories and their characters. So.
Oh, definitely. And the episode is over, of course, as most viewers will know, most listeners will know. I do want to point out one thing, that I think it was also a good idea to combine, in Railway series terms, because of course the first season is entirely adapted from the Railway series. It was a great idea to combine Edward's Day Out and Edward and Gordon, because good as both of those stories are, Edward's Day Out doesn't really lend itself to a 5.5-minute adaptation, and neither really does Edward and Gordon. So combining the two of them together to make one episode was a brilliant idea.
No, absolutely, and they definitely settled on a good running time. I think that 4.5-minute time frame,
right,
for every episode really worked to their favor, because not every Railway series story was the same length. I mean, some of them were longer, and some of them were definitely shorter, like Edward's Day Out, or Percy and the Trousers is one that's notably short.
Oh yes.
Later in the book Henry the Green Engine. So, but they settled on that 4-minute and 30-second runtime, and really, for the most part, that works in their favor.
Mm-hmm.
Some episodes that they have to flesh out, and very few that they ever had to really cut down. Although some they had to simplify or get rid of entirely, as in the case of The Missing Coach, because it was probably just a bit too complex to explain.
Right.
All of the mechanics of running the railway with the express coaches and all of that,
of course,
in the 4.5-minute runtime allotted.
Right. And of course, we will eventually, we'll probably have to do an entire episode on missing episodes, because there were at least 2 that I can think of right offhand. Probably more than that even, but I can think of 2 right offhand that were either planned and got partially made, or never got made at all, but were an idea. So
The Missing Coach and Gordon Goes Foreign.
Yeah, those are the 2 that I can
absolutely
think of. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But we'll talk more about that later. We hope that you have enjoyed this first ever episode of Talking Thomas, and so I just want to give a few final thoughts here, and really enjoyed the first 2 episodes of the Thomas the Tank Engine series. As I said, we'll probably put these out 2 per week, and it'll alternate what the content is about. Sometimes it'll be Thomas, sometimes it'll be Shining Time Station, sometimes it'll be merchandise, and sometimes it'll be Railway series. There is a plethora of things to talk about relating to Thomas. It's far more than just the TV series, and
oh, absolutely, yeah. It's a very large franchise with a lot to discuss.
Right. So those are my final thoughts. Orion, what are your final thoughts on these 2 episodes?
Great start to the show. Great start to the franchise, and I'm looking forward to discussing all of the future episodes that we will discuss, but this really established at least 3 of the characters,
right?
To start with, and the next few episodes we'll be establishing many more characters. So.
Yes, and so thank you so much for listening to Talking Thomas on whatever platform you are listening to it on. And we'll catch you next time.